purpose of this video is to talk about spoken language and is particularly specific for if you're creating a speech or an oral presentation where you need to communicate using your voice rather than through written language. So let's talk a little bit about this. When we talk about language, there's really two extremes here, and we call this the mode of the language. Language can either be more spoken or more written. And there's a couple of different characteristics to define these two things. Now, interestingly enough, whenever we ask students to produce one or the other, they usually end up somewhere in the middle. And there's a particular reason for this. The first thing to understand is that people are really good at using spoken language. You know, you talk to your friends, you talk to your family, and I'd argue that most of the time, as far as you're concerned, people understand what you're saying. You're a good communicator. But the moment someone asks you to do an oral presentation, you take all of those incredible skills and you throw them out the window, and instead you write something down. And you write something that sounds a little bit like an essay. You know, today I am going to be talking about. It makes you sound a lot like a robot because people don't really talk like that. So one of the biggest problems when it comes to writing an oral presentation is that students sort of think they have to write it like an essay, and then they read it to us and it sounds just like that. It doesn't sound natural, it doesn't sound casual. The other side of the coin is when it comes to written language, particularly in the middle school, a lot of students don't really understand the difference between writing and speaking. So they tend to write in the way that they speak. So when you ask for something like an essay, they tend to put in a lot of the characteristics of spoken language in there, which makes it seem less formal. The purpose of this video is to help try and show the difference between these two things so you get a better understanding about how to go about it. We're focusing mostly on spoken language in this case, but there is some information about written language which you can look at in other videos. So let's look at the key difference between these two things. So spoken language often uses prior knowledge. I could say something like, hey, remember that time that we did this? You know, when you talk to someone, you could say, oh, remember last Tuesday? And depending on the person you're speaking to, you can assume that they know because they were there. But if I was reading something that said, remember last Tuesday, and I wasn't there, it wouldn't make any sense to me. So spoken language tends to be much more adaptive to circumstances. I can use references to events and bits and pieces like that, assuming based on my audience, because I'm speaking to them, they're sitting there in front of me. When I write something, I don't necessarily know who is going to be reading it. If I wrote a textbook, I wouldn't be able to kind of direct it towards my best friend because it could be someone else reading it. So therefore, we say that written language needs to be self-contained. And the big thing behind this is the fact that, you know, everything that you need is there for you, okay? Now, spoken language is very much about being efficient, okay? When we speak, we want to be quick. And for that reason, certain elements of our language have developed over time. For example, if I'm speaking, rather than saying do not, should not, why not, I'll usually do things like shouldn't, wouldn't, don't, can't, everything along that line. I use abbreviated words. These have come through spoken language because they're quicker and they're more efficient. As well as that, I can sometimes say things like, oh, that thing over there, or look at this, as a way of actually using my, of saving me from explaining it. So it's very much about efficiency. So in spoken language, you'll see a lot of abbreviated words. In traditional written language, it's more about being clear than it is about being efficient. Okay, so for that reason, in a more formal piece or a textbook, you'll often find that they're saying do not, should not, will not, everything along that line. Okay, so that's a really important difference. When we think about spoken language, it doesn't really rely on rules like grammar. Okay, when we're listening to someone speak, I'm not really worried about where you're placing full stops or whether you're spelling words correctly because none of that information comes out to me. It is purely about the clarity of what you're saying and how well it's coming across. When it comes to written language, however, it relies heavily on the rules of grammar and spelling because if I can't read your spelling and I don't know when to take a breath because you haven't put full stops in it, it's going to compromise my ability to take meaning from your words. Okay. There's a couple of videos before this one that talk a little bit about density, but generally when we listen, and we'll look at this a little bit later on, when we listen, we can take in less information than if we read. So for that reason, when we speak, the density of our language tends to be lower. What that means is that there's less information per sentence. You might notice if you were reading a transcript of what I was saying right now, that I would be stopping quite frequently. There would be more full stops. Some sentences I'm using are very simple, and that's on purpose because when we listen, we take in less information. When we write in written language, we can actually put more pieces of information per sentence, and that makes the writing denser. Okay. The last point is that when it comes to spoken language, we can use additional elements like tone or visual elements. Okay, now you think about if you're listening or watching somebody speak, they might be using their hands, they might be pointing to something and saying, hey, look at this over here. And that doesn't mean anything from a text point of view, but because you're watching them, it has a completely different meaning. Tone is also really interesting. And think about something like sarcasm. You've probably been in a case before where you've been chatting online and someone's written something sarcastic and you haven't been able to follow. As well as that, looking on the other side, writing is usually much more impersonal and information centered. It can't use those additional elements. So just keep that in mind. So some facts about communication. I mentioned this before, but people can take in more information when they read than when they listen. That's important because when you're writing a speech, if you write it as though it's an essay, people will not be able to follow it. Spoken language is really important in building relationships. If you've ever met someone who speaks like a textbook, you'll find that actually they don't communicate very well in a spoken fashion. And usually people just don't understand what they're saying, which means that they probably don't have many friends, and it all falls apart from there. Spoken language, actually communicating with people the way that you would speak to someone normally, is important. It makes the relationship between you and your audience much stronger and more likely to be successful in communicating. We use spoken language a lot, but we don't always realize we're using it. Okay, we have to be conscious of how our language changes from when we are writing to when we are speaking. The more we can understand and use those skills, the better at communicating we will be. Students regularly get the wrong idea when they present information as an oral presentation. I said this before, people usually when they do an oral presentation, they don't just tell us what they think, they write us like an essay, and for that reason, they're usually really boring. So be aware of that. And of course, spoken language changes rapidly. What you'll find, and that's supposed to say written language, well, written language is slower to bring on formal changes. Apologies for that. But things like slang and terms and the way that people speak changes almost every day. Whereas written language, while it has had some major changes over time, it's slower to change. You can't kind of bring in a new piece of punctuation overnight. It's significant in that way. So just keep that in mind. So what do I want you to do with this information? When you're planning a speech, I want you to think about how you might explain the content to a friend or a family member. You might consider the type of language that you would use. What makes it comfortable for you? Rather than writing down your words for your speech, try this. Get a voice recorder and kind of just talk about the issue that you want to present, and then listen to it and think about or type up the language you used. You should notice that it's simpler and more comfortable, and you should notice that there's more frequent breaks that are easier to get to when you read it. Okay. Last tip, try and memorize the information of the presentation so that you can talk about it, not just read it off a sheet. Look, this is going to make your presentation more natural and more personal. The best speakers in the world do not read their speeches. What they do is they put down basic dot points of what they want to talk about, and then they allow themselves to talk about it in a much more natural and comfortable way. That's really difficult to do. It's a difficult skill, but gee, does it make a difference in effective spoken communication. I hope that you can use this information in your upcoming assignments and that it gives you some insight into making sure that your oral presentations are much more interesting, personal, and engaging.